Good morning, everybody. This is our panel on why an academic attack for Metatopia is good for game scholarship. We can start by introducing ourselves. My name is Nick Mizer. I teach in a Games and Simulation Arts and Sciences program at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. We'll go to Aaron.
Hi, everybody. My name is Aaron Trammell. I'm an assistant professor of informatics at UC Irvine, and I teach game design and critical theory.
I'm Trent Hergenrader. I am at the Rochester Institute of Technology in the Department of English, teaching primarily creative writing and media studies.
And I'm Shelly Jones. I'm also a professor of English at SUNY Delphi, where I mostly teach things like composition, but then do lots of research on nerdy games and such.
I think that the first thing that we should talk about is we're all in these different programs, and eventually we want to talk about what's the shape of games in academia and where the study of games fits in different places in academia. Maybe start that out on a personal level by talking about how did you end up where you are disciplinarily, and how did games come into that? I think that's a different answer for each of us. And having posed the question, I reserve the right to go last, so I'm going to pass it to any of the rest of you.
I can start. I've talked about this, my weird path to games a couple of times, many times. So I was an English major, then did a PhD at SUNY Binghamton in comparative literature. My dissertation was on Euripides, because it was a very kind of program, and it never occurred to me to actually study the things that I like to do outside of academia. Then I got a visiting assistant professor position at RIT, where I worked with Trent, and it was there that I discovered I had nothing left to say about Euripides, and needed to explore other things. And so being at an institution that is very tech-minded, that the student population is very nerdy, loves to embrace that. I am also very nerdy. I remember one of my first days coming into class wearing a Doctor Who t-shirt, and a student said, "That can't be the professor, she's wearing a Doctor Who t-shirt." But I was. And it was just there that I kind of realized, I actually could write academically and study the things that I like to do outside of academics. So I started writing about role-playing games and started writing about Dungeons and Dragons, and then through that met Aaron and became part of the editing board at Analog Game Studies, and then just have been continuing embracing my nerdy passions.
Go next. Again, my name is Trent Hergenrader. I did my graduate study at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And in that time, I got into game studies in a very weird way, in that it was through writing instruction, in that I was doing sort of a digital writing instruction across professional writing, composition, and creative writing. And there's very little in creative writing. And I came to find that creative writing is a pretty stodgy, old school, print-based kind of discipline. And I wanted to shake things up with genre fiction. I'm a science fiction, fantasy, horror writer. And really, one of the things that I got into was electronic literature, digital literature, and then digital games. Started reading things like James G's What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy, and then some of the other publications. Really started getting me into thinking about how role-playing could be used to teach creative writing, rather than having students that wanted to write the Great American Short Story or whatever it is. It's no. Get situated in a character's perspective, make decisions, and then that's how plot will be generated. So I started much more on the digital side of things, using Fallout 3 and other digital role-playing games as a means to teach students about perspective, and how plot follows from characters' decisions. And then more and more as I got into it, I realized, looking back, I'm a child of the 80s. I played a ton of Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, and other TSR. We had all the TSR old role-playing games, Food Hill, Top Secret, Star Frontiers, and that really learned to tell stories and think about character creation and things like that. And it's really not stopped. I've just been doing world building and role playing as a means for creative writing. And the funny thing is, now I hardly do any game studies anymore, because advanced these creative writing classes is so high, I no longer have space in my schedule to teach something that's not that, which it's not a bad problem to have.
Good morning, everybody. I want to say before I give some background notes. First, I'm from New Jersey, so it's cool to be at Metatopia, even if it's virtually. So, my heart's out there. My body's not. So back in like 2006, 2007, I had a bunch of jobs I didn't really like, and I was hanging out with my friends in these sort of like joint apartment situations. And I remember like playing this Paper Mario 3D World, the one that was on the Wii, did the perspective changing, and we were all laughing and joking about it. And I just remember being like, "This is what's happening. This is the future of popular culture. I really want to be somebody who understands this and studies this." And I had a kind of dead-end job at Verizon Wireless, and I kind of used all the time I could get on the computer, and I found a site called Game Studies. I was like, whoa, there's people who write about this. I want to be one of these people also. That's kind of the origin story. So then I went to grad school. I also wound up at SUNY Binghamton, like Shelly. I think we were like ships in the night while we were there. But then I came back over and I studied at Rutgers University's communication and media school in their media department. And really just it was like a great popular culture program. And we started asking ourselves questions like, what does this mean in society to be consuming, something like a board game, but also like, what does it mean to be consuming like Star Trek or, science fiction or anything like that in the news? Anything like that that's in the sort of zeitgeist of the moment. So that was really exciting and cool. And eventually, I got a job, and that's history. But I would say there's a few other landmarks that I just want to kind of go over before flipping it over to Nick. But first, in 2005, when people studied games, there were a few people who would talk about things like role-playing games and tabletop games and stuff like that. It was far from the norm at the moment. Most people at that moment were really enamored with digital games, especially massively multiplayer digital games. That was like, it's so exciting. What the thing that everybody was like fascinated with about 20 years ago was just like, what does it mean to be in an online virtual world? And when I bumped into Evan Turner, who's not on this panel, and I think Nick Mizer may have even been at this conference, PCA, in 2013. I was just so excited to meet other people who were doing the same kind of work. Like Nick and I had both been doing our dissertation work on Dungeons and Dragons at the time. And this, for us, I think was like one of those flashpoint moments where we were like, oh my God, it's not just that people are studying games, but people are studying the games that we're interested in. And so that is the kind of the origin story of the journal Analog Game Studies that Evan Turner, Emily Waldron, and I founded, and that Shelly works at now. But I think also the sort of origin story for a lot of this really brilliant work that's going on today in tabletop games and board games. And so it's just really exciting now to be at Metatopia and see everybody here saying like, okay, so if we're interested in getting involved, rolling up our sleeves, how do we open that door for ourselves? And to have been part of like this wonderful team here that has kind of laid the groundwork to do that is just such an exciting thing, and happy to dig in there. So yeah, hey everybody.
Wow, that's so cool to hear everyone's stories on this, because you don't ask like a historian like, so how'd you get into history? It's like, well, I became a history major and then I didn't stop doing that. But like, no one, I mean, there are, now that we do have programs that like can skew this way, eventually people will say like, oh, well, I just joined the game studies program at my school and whatever. But at least in this era, that's not what happened. So it's really cool hearing that story. And that 2013 moment, that PCA, I think for me, it was a real big flashpoint too. And then the game studies at PCA is a good example of like, it was 98% or more talking about video games. People doing great and amazing work, but the people who were chairs at the time were supportive of us that were coming in not talking about that, and that ratio has shifted over time at PCA game studies, just like it has everywhere else. But for myself, I started out actually in anthropology, and I was really getting into. I thought I was going to be like a mythographer, like studying mythology and folklore and ritual and so forth. And I got to my senior year, and we had to do a like undergraduate thesis, and I realized, wait a second, myth and ritual, narrative and gameplay, and it's just some light bulb went off. And I was like, wait a second, I think I can do this. I had an advisor that was willing to support me in that, and then started rifling around for PhD programs that would let me do that. And so it's always been this, and I think this is true for a lot of people that like kind of started in, or I think it's still true actually. People finding their way into game studies are often, even if you have a supportive academic advisor or like a mentor in some way, that they're often like, I don't know, like if you're a history student and you like really want to get into World War II something or whatever era, and even if your advisor's not into that, they like, here's the body of literature, here you go. And then, I mean, when I started, I may be wrong, but I think that when I was writing my undergraduate thesis, I think that in terms of books, there was Gary Allen Fine's Shared Fantasy and performing art. Who's that author? Yes, yeah. And then soon after we had like Sarah Bowman and Michael Tresca and Cover like coming in the pipeline. But there was a time when it was just like I think I read all of the RPG scholarship, and now that's like not even possible because of the huge growth in that. So it's really exciting to me, and I think that like this Metatopia coming together is like an interesting turn in terms of thinking about. We have to be thinking. I was joking before the panel started. We're always kind of like insider outsider, right? We're like in each of our programs in a certain way. We like don't fit in with what people would expect. So we're already like, as gaming academics, you're navigating that side of things, always trying to explain to people, no, not like video games, like role playing games. That you tell people 5 times, administrators, then they still don't understand what you do. And then on the other side, we've got like all of our friends who are like gamers and game designers, and most of us kind of are, not just one or the other too. So I think that Metatopia is really exciting place to think about how all of that interacts. Yeah. So I mean, how does that interact for you guys? Like how either on the academic side, how your discipline feels about what you do in game studies, or like how do you feel like the studies that you're doing interact with the broader gaming community? How's that played out?
I can take a look on this and then open it up to you. So I'll just add some context, which is what I like to call the 3 waves of game studies, which is I'm not going to even really get into what we're all here to talk about, which is board and tabletop games. But in the 90s, when the field kind of opened up and some of the very first game studies publications came out, the field was really interested in what it meant to disambiguate and separate games from literature, right? So that early moment was a moment where a lot of people wanted to argue, games are no different than any other literature, television, film, etc., any other media. And a lot of game studies scholars at this early moment wanted to argue, actually, there's some very different things about games, right? Like, they're non-linear, for instance, and that means you're encountering narratives in different ways. There's twisting paths that you take through things. So this is kind of the very early moment of game studies, was this kind of discussion about, is this literature, and if it is, how is it literature? How do we talk about representation in games? And if it's not, how do we talk about agency and like moving through different pathways in games? The second moment comes in like the mid-aughts, and I think this is like kind of the wave of social sciences in game studies. And here, right, like it's a conversation, it's attached to many media panics, many of the moments where people were concerned about censoring games or rating games and stuff like that. And a lot of game studies scholarships really want to support and advocate the importance and role of games in people's lives, right? So this is kind of the Games for Impact moment. And there's a lot of scholarships in education at this moment, arguing that, games are ways that constructively help children learn, they help children grow, they're third space that children go into, as well as some like like really big, like Jane McGonigal's book, How Do Reality is Broken, How Do King Games Help Us Save the World, right? Like some stuff that was really lofty inspirations about showing how games could be really crucial to defining our futures as a people. And then finally, and I think this is the moment we're in now, and I think this is why we have this sort of energy around tabletop games, is that we're in this moment that's about critical games. And this happens, I think, right now because of a lot of the different voices that got brought into games because of Gamergate, which for those of you who may not be familiar with, was a moment where games and game reviews got put under a lot of scrutiny, and a lot of people got very harassed by a lot of bigots online. And so basically that level of persecution reflected into the field level. I think people sort of being interested in different ways of thinking about games, different lenses that you can look at games through, right? What does it mean to play games as a woman? What does it mean to play games as a black man? What does it mean to discuss the production of games globally and who's doing the labor to produce game machines? What does it mean to have shipping containers, right, that are going overseas and getting caught in canals and messing up the lives of the people who do Kickstarters for games right now? I think all of that is kind of where we come in as people who are really interested in board and tabletop games, because this is the moment where suddenly a lot of the things that were taken for granted, like for video games, gets challenged. And I think we are some of those voices that are saying like, hey, well, actually, maybe there's lots of other games we play, and maybe these other games we play are kind of exciting and important too, in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, if I can jump off on that, because it's a great segue into what I was going to say, is that I look at this from writing studies as games as a form of literacy almost. And when we're talking about forms of literacy, you need to be able to both consume critically, but then also produce. And this is one of the things that when, there are things like Scratch Junior and other, tools like Twine that are pretty low end in terms of like getting access. But, if you're going to be making a sophisticated game, there's thousands of lines of code, and all these things where you can tabletop, you can just grab some paper and play test something in minutes, right, with a group of people. It's much easier, and the stakes are much lower in terms of where the money is going, and all these other kind of things. So I think that's one of the things, going back to what Aaron was just saying, like being able to play a game and be able to analyze the mechanics, which goes back to the early studies in game studies. The mechanics are really one of the things you're looking at. And then also sort of transmedia quality, how are games similar but different from film? How are they similar but different from print fiction? Comic books, all those kinds of things. And the other part too is I've got two boys that are 9 and 12, and games are absolutely part of their learning ecology. It is absolutely every part of their day they are engaged with games in some way. And I think this is where in academia it becomes difficult, because I'm of the opinion that there's a pretty hard line somewhere around the birthdays of 1970 or so. If you're older than that, I don't think games were as formative for you as growing up, right? Maybe you had Risk and Monopoly and things like that, but being a Gen Xer, they were formative. We had an Atari, we had tons of board games. I played them with my brothers all the time. We played all these role-playing games, and there's a real division in academia between the people, like Nick was saying, the administrators, the people who are awarding grants, the people who are serving on journals. And it's only at this stage now where I think where we're getting into our 40s and 50s, where these generation of gamers are now getting into positions where, okay, I'm the chair of the hiring committee, and I'm going to be looking at this work. Where 10 or 15 years ago, I think you were a real duck in strange waters if you were trying to, do things in games. So there's a couple things that I would say, like, people look and, like, I can tell the RIT coming through, especially with somebody in game design, we need to help them with the grammar and the theory behind what makes for good games and what makes for interesting games, because they feel it. And so much of the time that they said, I've never had anybody in high school or my parents or anything take games seriously, right? And they start to talk to you like they're going to teach you something, and it's like, wait, like, this is what I do, right? Let's elevate here. So it's a really exciting time. When I started my job in 2013, it was very much like you're off on the deep end in an English department, and now it's slowly becoming much, much more commonplace. And like I think you were just saying, Aaron, the diversity that is now flooding in is all for the best.
Yeah, I just completely agree with everything both of them just said. It mirrors my same experience in terms of nobody in my department quite understands what I do. There's one other person who kind of sort of isn't understanding video a scholarship on that a bit, but also is like Irish studies literature person. So he just is a big nerd and sometimes writes scholarships on that. But it's odd, like they don't like other people in the area don't quite know what it is that I do, but the students do. I just had this wonderful experience where a student came up to me and was like, "Oh, I just saw this thing," and I took a class in mythology, and so he came up to me and was very excited that he had watched Critical Role, and there was a creation myth in Critical Role, and we had just talked about creation myth, and he was able to put those two things together, and he was trying to explain to me what D&D was, and I'm like, I know, I just wrote a book on it, I get it. Like, it's okay, you don't know that because I'm not about to tell you that, but I know what a DM is. It was just this wonderful moment where they were able to take what we had in the classroom and actually apply that to what they're consuming as, for fun. And that was just such a lovely moment, and it was really the highlight of my day that day. But I can have those conversations with my students. So I can't necessarily have those conversations with all of my colleagues, and definitely not my administrators, unfortunately.
I think that brings up a good thing that we should maybe talk about. And for someone who's not involved in academia or involved in like the weird spaces of academia that we've stumbled into, I think that there's a lot of terms that like kind of are used interchangeably that we could like maybe do some differentiation about. Like people talk about game theory, and like that's an academic study that involves games. Talk about game studies. We can talk about like if you think of Sebastian and the Status Role-Playing Game Studies book that they helped us all put together, there's the set of chapters in here, the disciplinary ones of sociology and role-playing games, psychology and role-playing games, literary stuff. So there's games in all of these various disciplines. Is that whether or not that's game studies or not, but they manifest differently. And then we've got the game-based learning and gamification. Like these are all like kind of it's a big universe, and it's So I don't know. You guys have thoughts on like how not so much like we need to. I'm not interested in siloing these things, but like sometimes when people only touch one part of it, they don't realize like how far it goes and the different ways this can manifest. Maybe the starting question is, well, where do you position yourself in that universe, and like how do you relate to those other things or differentiate yourself? Like I probably none of us here have ourselves as game theorists in the mathematical sense, but what is that line in game studies as it's not a discipline, it's a something. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can grab the game-based learning and gamification side, because that's really where I see myself. I like to do the game studies looking at games and culture, but really what I do is use games, right? And the idea is that the core of this, you have certain learning outcomes that you're trying to get to, and then you've got certain games that have certain mechanics, and you have to line up the mechanics to the learning outcomes, right? So I don't play the game of life in a role-playing, in a creative writing class. You conceivably could, but the whole point of a role-playing game is that you assume the identity of an individual character, and you are 100% responsible for that character's decision-making. Just like when you're writing a fictional story, you are 100% in charge of what the protagonist is going to do. So for me, the role-playing game is a great tool to be able to teach concept fiction writing. Don't come up with true love conquers in the end or any other great thematic things. Think about you are a character who's situated in that matrix of social forces, and all sorts of things. You have to make decisions from moment to moment, and you don't control whether they work or whether they don't work because you have the dice in there, right? Like you try, just like all of us do, we try to play to our strengths because the percentages are in your favor. Sometimes you're going to botch that roll that should have been nailed on. Other times you get that Hail Mary that you get, right? And that's like it creates wonder and all these kind of things and excitement around fiction writing, as opposed to thinking so much of standardized testing has taught students that like the act of reading literature is mining for gold. You got to find the big meaning, right? And it's just such a impoverished way of looking at the ways that we've always looked at storytelling. Really, that's the idea, is that there's some tension between game-based learning and gamification. Gamification is more using things like leaderboards and scoreboards, right? So you've got like a smart device that says, okay, I've got how many steps, and Nick and Shelly and Aaron have how many steps, and we're going to have a leaderboard. Like the idea of the game is completely divorced from the concept is going to rank you, right? Those kinds of things. Whereas game-based learning is much more intimately connected between the learning outcomes and the game. And this is also a separate thing from games that are meant for learning. Like you're going to play this game and you're going to learn something from it, as opposed to I'm going to grab Blades in the Dark and we're going to use this as a role-playing game like that. Not only not make that game be taught, but I'm using it as a teaching tool. Just like no novelist writes their novel, so it will be studied. We can use those in English classes, film, right, with all those kinds of things. So there are different games where it's like, okay, if you play this game, you're going to learn more about this subject through the playing of it, and that's sort of a learning game. That's where too, a lot of the things I think what Aaron was talking about earlier with games, education. What I saw at least were people from industry coming in and being like, okay, we're going to get iPads for everybody. We're going to make a digital game. We're going to roll it out. We don't need to train teachers. We don't need to do anything. The kids will just absorb it and it will be great, right? And what we find is that actually doesn't work at all. And the things that work the best are simulations, are role play that requires a high degree of training for the teacher to understand what they're doing, and interactivity, and it's messy and it's hard to assess, and all these things. All the things that people want to have, these big educational solutions, hate, right? Like, what do you mean it's messy and it's hard to assess and it's expensive and it requires training, right? Like, that's a ridiculous thing. So, again, it's one of those things that where I'm at now, I started off in the early 2010s trying to proselytize, and now I'm more like, hey, I do this thing, it works great, students are banging at my door, if you want to find me and I can help you, then we'll go there, right? Like, but this is never going to, no one's going to get rich doing this stuff, but it's about how can we make this experience better, how can we have these transformative experiences through play, which are deeply invested in what they're learning, and the game is an intimate part of that.
I think that's it's fantastic. And thinking about, well, Aaron, you said that the moment is critical games, and I think there's a certain sense that we can think about. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but to me that resonates with thinking about something like game-based learning. And if we define a certain set of critical games as thinking about how games can be used in I'm teaching a class right now where our topic that we decided on is games as praxis. Like, how can games change the world and imagining the world differently and then bringing that world into being? Where do games fit into that? And I think that that's an aspect of critical games, and that's this game-based learning. It's applying. It's one specific kind of applied gaming that I think that we see that is really exciting and potentially really powerful at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's important when we think about critique, right, that we structure it broadly. There's not one avenue of critique. So, yeah, ways to think through how a game might stage an intervention in your community is a really important form of critique. But so is, thinking about how to review a game that just came out and how to talk about what's been represented in it, right, is another one. I think, the more kinds of legitimate forms of criticism that get put on games, the better we come to understand them, right? That's why we go and open up a newspaper to read movie reviews or TV reviews. We're looking to understand those artifacts of popular culture that are being critiqued by the critics. So I think a broad-ranging approach and disciplinarily is really important in that regard.
I think that's where Aaron and my research tends to lie. We tend to look at games as texts, as artifacts built and created, and then what can we glean from that, right? So Aaron and I definitely look at things like how does Dungeons and Dragons represent people of color, right? How does Dungeons and Dragons represent people with issues of gender, things like that? Because they are, again, coming from more of an English background, I tend to just look at everything as a text to be analyzed, right? Instead of starting to look at games as a text, right? As a cultural artifact, what can we learn from that? What does that mean? What does it mean to a gamer? How can that be more inclusive, right? Because if we did this panel 20 years ago, maybe not even that long, I wouldn't be here, right? As a woman, I would probably not necessarily have been playing games, and certainly how board games represent our culture.
Yeah, thinking about games as things that are out there out in the world doing things, and so then it makes sense that we need people who can both look at games that exist and be like, this is what I think this game is out there doing in the world, and then people that are like, here's some things that I think that we could make games do, like in Trent's category, and I think other kind of activist work that can be done in games as well. That those like synergize really well. And I think that we're at the halfway point. Maybe it's a good time to pivot and think about like, how does all of this work that we're doing, or how can it interact with the people who are on the front lines, so to speak, in terms of like they're actively designing games. Like, what is that relationship? How can that relationship? What can that look like? What has it looked like? This has been a big year for this. I think in many ways we had the Bradley Tabletop Symposium in the spring, we had Generation Analog, and then we had academic track here. It's kind of a that's a lot of you talking about the academic study of role playing games, and I think in the context of like I like the Gen Con pairing with Generation Analog of like both the designers and the players, and like so we're realizing that games scholarship is part of a larger ecosystem. So I don't know, like what do you guys think that what's the current position of that, and where history and futures of where that can go?
Okay, well, I was just going to say that has always been an important thing for analog game studies, the journal, right? That was really a marriage of, yes, we're doing these really cool things in terms of scholarship, and that's a burgeoning field, but also wanting to make sure that that is an accessible place for game designers too, right? And doing interviews with game designers or having game designers write about the practice of design and what that means, right? And I think you're right, Nick. We are seeing more of that marriage and more scholarship being geared towards not so much game designers are getting it wrong, here's how to make it right, but this is something we're noticing, and players are talking out, right? Players have more agency. This is what players want to see. Want to be successful. Maybe think about not gendering your rule books, for example, right? Like some very minor things that could then make the game feel more inclusive if that's what you're going for. Some don't. And there's certainly a market for that too. So I think there's, it really is this kind of marriage. Like I think a lot of times folks, early on, I think there was more of a bifurcation of the two, right? And maybe there are some folks who are straddling both, but I think we're seeing talk about the same things. We're just using different language, right? We're just using different verbiage. And if we could have these kinds of like Metatopia where we kind of come together and say, oh, you talk about this too. Oh, we just call that this. Right? Like we just have a academic jargon term for that, but really what we're talking about is what you're doing. And so let's talk about how that could be better. So I think trying to get rid of those access barriers that academia is so good at creating at all levels would be really helpful. And I think doing a panel like this is that forward.
Yeah, I want to build on that a little. I think one thing that analog or tabletop games could learn from the digital game community is that in digital games, the academic work on games and the industry work on games kind of grew up together. The people doing those researches moved on, moved on into positions as consultants in the field. People in the field sometimes moved into research positions at academies. And there was a lot of cross-pollination between the two that I think was very, very healthy for the both. And it actually helped the industry grow and, grow critically, thinking inward, looking inward at itself in a lot of ways. And I think to some extent what Shelly is saying with the sort of analog game tabletop community is correct also. I don't think that we have been in as close dialogue with industry and design as we could be. And that's a missed opportunity. We could be working closely together because I know as academics we really value all of this sort of amazing design insights and design works. My first experience at Metatopia was as a designer, not a researcher, and it blew my mind how great and generous the feedback on the games I brought from the community were. And so I think that there's a real opportunity there for us to be working carefully and in tandem with design as we grow forward. Because this, let's be honest, this has been a big 5 years, not just for us in the academy, but for the tabletop industry and the role-playing game industry in general. Things I think are growing in a rate and in a way that no one could have anticipated 10 years ago.
What I was going to say on this is that, colleges, especially, RIT is very big on applied sort of knowledge, right? Like, we don't want it to get too far into theory when everything can be applied. And games are one of these intensely interdisciplinary, regardless whether you're talking about tabletop or digital, it is so intensely interdisciplinary. And then when you get to the point where we've got students who don't want to join a big AAA game studio, they want to create their own indie games. Well, you need to have a budget, you need to get art, you need to kickstart, you need to market, you need to write, you need to, like all these aspects. Either be a jack of all trades or assemble a team. And where I'm at, they're always like, well, how do we get co-ops? How do we get internships? And how do we get people who are doing this stuff? And it's kind of hard because it's changing so fast. And it's like, okay, well, who does that kind of work? Who's been doing that kind of work? Well, the indie tabletop scene is doing that kind of work. And I've known students that are running Kickstarter. They're trying to get a digital game. They got to get, 90 grand or whatever. And it's like, well, if you're going to do a tabletop RPG, you got to get like 2 grand. At both, right? So again, lowering that bar, having that access, and then also being able to say, hey, look, this might be the future. There may be people who could be indie designers and shape their own careers rather than having to get in at a AAA studio at the bottom and wait for 10 years before you start writing your own games. So I think it's one of those things that, I'm always looking to try and find people who are in industry that would be willing to mentor and come in and talk about what it's like to have been indie game designer before Kickstarter, before the internet, before all of these things. How did they come along? How do you have to think in order to make that work? Rather than just like, oh, because being a fiction writer, it's the same thing. The young creators tend to think I'm going to write this novel and everyone's going to swoon and I'm going to go to the top of the charts. It doesn't work like that. Like, you may have a good idea, but there's a lot of things in the execution of it, and that's where you need people who've been there and done that can lend their experience to help young people carry that mission forward. And I think going back, we're getting this is one of the things like Shelly had said too. Like when I started doing things with role playing games, I had a couple people in my department kind of saying, "Oh, that's great. We're servicing all the young men." And I'm like, no. Like my classes are 50-50 men and women, right? And and then there's now in the last few years, lots of students who are identifying as trans. We're bringing that in where we don't need to have gender binaries in our tabletop role playing games and in our world building. We can have fluidity there, right? So it's part of these worlds that they're living in right now, and this is where it's less about reproducing the culture that I grew up with and the way that I was trained, and really trying to look at through the eyes of a 19, 20, 21-year-old, what's the future that they're going to be moving into, and how can we best equip them to bring all those skills and do important, cool world-changing things, as we move into the future. And I think having the experience, the deep experience from tabletop designers is absolutely crucial to that.
That's huge. Your point about the scoping of like video games versus analog games. In a game design program that's 98% a digital game. A lot of students come in that a master's student a year wants to make an open world RPG where just story can emerge out of anywhere, and I'm like, yeah, that's fantastic. You will never be able to program that in a year, but you could definitely make a tabletop role playing game about that in a year. And it's a little bit of a hard sell at first, but once they start to grasp it, and I think that increasingly, my hope is at least that on the industry side, that it's not enough just to know how to do Unity or 3D modeling or whatever it might be. That it becomes, I think it's increasingly becoming recognized that like analog game design chops are real game design chops, like real that serve on the video game side as well. And then to go back to a point that Shelly and I think Aaron you made too, is that I think the relationship between academics and designers is, I think part of my hope is like dismantling the gated communities of academia. And one of the ways I think about that is increasingly thinking about and some of my anthropology colleagues have been talking about games. We've been increasingly talking about games as methodology. designing a a game is a form of research, and it's an applied experiment, and even playing games can be a form of methodology. And so, thinking of people who are primarily practitioners as like co-thinkers as well. Like obviously, if you're a game designer, you're thinking very, very deeply about all of the things that game studies scholars are writing about. And so like it's two modes of the same thing. And then I think that there's like thinking of that feedback back and forth as virtuous cycle of deeper thinking and deeper practice. Or even in the game learning front of things, my recurring line has been that course design is game design. Like when you design a course, you're just game. It's a very specialized form of game, but it's so that's kind of my pitch to the other faculty is trying to push the gameful learning side of things. But that also means that like because most of like before I started before I got a teaching position, I wasn't all that interested in gameful learning, gamification, except kind of in the abstracts. It wasn't something I did. I want to just study games like anthropologically. But then as soon as I'm in the classroom, I'm like, of course, I need to start using these powerful tools in my own design. And so all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I guess I do gameful learning as well, because that's just in practice. That's what makes me do. It's living out those ideas.
I'd say on that too, that it was when I was in graduate school that there's all this debate about politics in college classrooms, and one of the things that I remember reading is that every syllabus is a political choice that you're making. What are you going to leave in? What are you going to leave out? Also with text, right? How are you going to represent? Who are you going to represent? And I think largely with games, it's mechanics and it's all these other things. Like how are you? Like what is the world that you are creating, and what are the rules that you're playing by? Those are political choices, right? And I think a lot of times creators aren't intentional about it, and I think being having this academic focus and being able to say we're going to examine these in text asks people to say, okay, put on a layer of critical thinking about this. What is it that you are saying that it makes you win? Everyone's watching Squid Game, right? Like, what do you need to do to win that game? And is that really what you want to have as a representation out in the world? 20 years ago, I don't think maybe that would have been part of the conversation, but I think this is one of the things too that as we're getting more and more game designers coming through our programs, we want them to say, hey, look, someone may misunderstand what you've been, like, I hope you're not trying to say this in your game, but your mechanics lead me to believe that this could be read as being sexist or racist or ableist or something like that. So before it gets out into the world, let's back it up and be a little bit more mindful about those things.
I think that's fantastic. I have another topic we can move on to, but I don't want to cut off it. Do you have anything else on that? So I'm thinking now about there's kind of this. I don't know if the question is this a feature or a bug? Is that academic work on games is always behind that, like the designers are the cutting edge of the front line, the designers and players moving the ball forward. And I tell my students, the video game students, that like all of the most cutting edge technology is being done in analog game studies in terms of like how do games and storytelling interact? What are technologies of the imagination? Like what is it? Ways of like bringing people together and thinking about technology in a broader sense than like is there a microchip involved? It's ways of being and doing that like help us do these things. And so game design and the game community is just going forward at light speed, and all of these exciting things. Like I mean, just look around at Metatopia and academia. Like it's kind of like behind. So there's a certain extent to which that's kind of inevitable. Like so, I guess the question is, bug or feature. Like what do we make of that, and how do we take our cue from from designers and players that are plowing forward and like make our work support what that advance.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, Nick. And I think that in some ways our work is, I'm going to call it dirty work, right? Like infrastructural. We're doing some work with sewage here. We're making pipelines. I think at my school there's an esports program, and so a lot of the folks who study games here are really interested and invested in the future of that esports program. And one of the problems, if you're familiar with esports, that you know is that there's a humongous gender inequities in who gets to participate and who doesn't. And a lot of the people doing that work use the research and the insights that they've made by researching games and researching communities of play. And now they're going out into the world and trying to build collaborations with like high schools to get women gaming earlier so that they can be part of the sort of esports pipeline. And I think that's the sort of potential of games research here, right? Like it's not necessarily about designing that esports game or even making a student or someone who plays that esports game. It's that sort of infrastructural work where, like, look at Shelly's work. Shelly writes about ableism in Dungeons and Dragons, and that is the sort of work that somebody at Wizards of the Coast might read and say, like, oh, actually, this is a problem. How do we get more people with different levels of ability involved with the game? And I think that sort of infrastructural work is one of the really important things that we're all doing as researchers in tandem again with the designers. So we're doing, of course, the stuff that we're all geeking out about, excited about, and in love with in so many ways.
I love everything Aaron just said. To go along with that, I think it partly is a feature because of some of our really stuffy old practices in academia, right? Like the book that I just edited, had the idea for and started working on in 2018. It just came out, right? Like pandemic aside, it just takes a really long time for the old school print to happen, right? And a lot of times in academia, that's what we're valuing as opposed to being willing to go to something like the Not Your Mama's Game of blog, right? Like that is perfectly good evidence, perfectly good discussions of game design, and yet because of the ways that we all work within and have to learn how to parlay within, we sometimes shy away from those kinds of things, right? Because we are insisting on something physical, right? And that is the hierarchy of academia. Partly why things like analog game studies or just these kinds of conferences where we can say, oh, we have this recording, people said this, we can use this as evidence, right? So having more of these kinds of conversations and not always relying on the printed word as being the gospel, I think is helpful because there are so many great conversations happening here on Twitter, all over the place. Game Studies Twitter is amazing. I love getting about these different conversations that are happening about role-playing games and what people are noticing as they're actually playing the game. And so I think that's it's a feature, but it is also a bug in the sense of being the practitioners who, I'm not saying don't publish books, but I know Aaron has like 3 in the pipeline right now, right? But we need to be more embracing of these other conversations and elevate these conversations to equal status to these publications.
There's the outward-facing other academics, right? These are the things that we'll engage with. But there's also bringing games into the classroom, and this is one of the things that I think is really important. Is when I teach intro to creative writing, I connect games to these older artistic sort of avant-garde movements like Dada and Olipo and Fluxus, and they use rules and they use language games and they do all these things that are all pre-computational, right? Mathematical, but not using computers to do them, and try to put that in a sort of continuum that people have always been playing games like this with language, and then I'll give them a sheet of a bunch of games, and it's like, okay, we're going to play some storytelling games or some poetry games, and if you have games, because they always do, if you have games that I haven't heard of, please add them to the list. And one of the things that I think is hard, especially in an English department, is if you assign a book, it's going to take you a good week or so to give students enough time to read it, where they can watch a movie, over a single night, and they can play a game in a single session, right? So I can say, get together on Tuesday, play this game, we'll come back on Thursday and talk about it. Where you can do that with a short story, you can do that with a book. But that's where too, like this idea that you can extend as an educator to be able to say, hey, I understand that in your media ecology, games are an important part, and I may not know about it. Come to me and tell me what games that you know, Steam Quest games, you know, that you kickstarted that I may not have heard of. As long as we can get a couple PDFs passed around, we're good to go, right? Like you don't need to say everyone needs to have a PS5, you know, and all these things. It's like if you just have those games. So I think that there's that aspect that can be very of the moment. And what I'm always trying to do, thinking some of the game designers through, is how can I have students engaging with these artistic experiments like Dada and Olivo and say, well, you know what, I know that you played Skyrim, I know that you played all these big AAA games, but really think about how can we completely turn upside down when we think about what games can do and what they can get at, right? And like all sorts of different narrative games and other things like that. But we don't have video games that have done this yet. You know, we don't have tabletop games that have done this yet. But if I show you this weird stuff from, you know, a century ago, did you start to see how that may make sense in the 21st century? So, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, how much are we talking to each other as professors, and how much are we talking to like the general culture? And I think the answer is yes, we need to do both all the time.
7-minute warning.
And I think that points at like the media on the side, like print versus digital. That I think Shelly, you're pointing towards something, and Trent, you are too. There's something cool about Metatopia, and this is true of Bradley and Spring as well. Is that there needs to be a space for not just here's my polished thing that I've that's completely ready to go, and that's where academia sits. Like that's where academia is comfortable, and maybe it's like a COVID era thing that like cracked that open, and all of a sudden we saw inside academics' houses, like even our coworkers' houses, you know, just in the background, something shifted, and there seems more of a space, and I think certainly a hunger for academics to be like, here's some stuff. Like I mean, my session that I'm doing with Bill White and Nick Lalone tomorrow is like we did one interview so far on this project that we're. And just like, hey, like here's some stuff we're thinking about. Like, do you want to think about that with us and talk with us about that? And then there's something really energetic about that really, like, I think it's short-circuiting some of those broken pathways in academia that I think is really exciting.
About process as opposed to polish.
Yeah, it's moving the ball down the field. I guess like the game's metaphor is like rather than being so sure about everything as we move forward. Which I think one last question. I don't know if this will take us through to the end, but one last thing I kind of wanted us to maybe think about is, and this is I think this might be a tall order, but you know we're all gamers here, and I think a lot about Ursula K. Le Guin's acceptance speech from 2015, 2016. Got the Hugo Award. She was talking about kind of like a capitalist realism sort of realization about it's easier to imagine the end of the world than capitalism, but saying we need people, we need writers, she says, because she's talking to authors who can imagine better futures. And so I think that as academics, it'd be really, really easy for us to spin up some dystopias about where academia is going to go in the next 5 to 10 years. And so that would be the low-hanging fruit. What I was hoping that we could do is get some post-apocalyptic fiction written together right now. Like, where can game studies go? Like, what does that look like? What are some positive visions of like 10 years from now that we like? What can that look like? Do we have a bunch of game studies programs at schools? And feel free to or is it that there's people doing games in every program that's out there has some gamers doing, and what's the relationship with the industry? So like kind of some Imagineering work. Like what do you think that looks like?
I'm gonna have a very modest dream, but I think it's an important one. I think there's two things, and the words I use are read and play. And so right now, right, like we're in this moment of hyper acceleration of economies, of discourse, of politics, of all these things. It can kind of be frightening. And I think one of the things that's really important as we move to critique and think through what the role of is to consume more and be able to, in that moment of consumption, reflect more about what's actually out there. So I think my post-apocalyptic utopia would be one where we could read more writing about games and play more games, because I think that's a really healthy space to be in, to be able to read and play mindfully.
What I was going to say too is one of the things that I keep thinking about with higher ed and what seems like there's going to be some major change, right? Some major, whether it's a collapse or whatever you want to call it. But I think there's going to be a re-emphasis on the local, right? Like, what is this? We've got a big university in town. What does it mean to be here, right? And I just keep thinking when I'm talking with my students, that are especially from here, like Rochester, no one really thinks about Rochester as a town, but the people who live here do, right? So can we make games? Can we make tabletop games and have Rochester as the setting? They use Rochester history. They use Rochester figures, right? We've got a Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, like all these things. Like, why don't we use that stuff to set it not in a fictional world or LA or New York, but Rochester, right? And like, let's either
you guys have garbage plates, you have a sewer system, and a dinosaur barbecue. Like, how can you not be thinking of Rochester as a town?
Right, exactly. So and that's where too I think that having that outward, that we're not up in the ivory tower, but we're actually people who are in line with you in the grocery store. Your students live in this community, and there's so much emphasis. So much of it is about the digital hub that upstate New York is, right? But I still think too, if you're a game designer, yeah, you're working on your big AAA thing. You can also kickstart a little, thing on the side, right? That's much easier. You've got much more control over that. So that's why I think that's my sort of utopian vision, is that we're going to come back and remember that we're all located. But the dystopia is all universities go out on the internet, no one knows where anyone is, right? You know what I mean? Like, you can be anywhere in the world. But the opposite I'm hoping will happen with the real sort of situated, located, local history, all those kinds of things that can then be brought into to different kinds of games that we play together in physical spaces, like not on Roll20, but we're going to open up a public space. Come in, bring your games, we'll talk, we'll do whatever game design. There's a great culture of that on campus, but I think that can easily extend into the wider culture as well.
And just to synthesize those two things, it's really about slowing down, right? Like, so many things are so fast, but really it's about slowing down and appreciating what we actually have, and then building up from that, right? And I'm just going to say that as a Rochester native, I'm loving that conversation. Also, all of us have touchdowns to upstate New York, which Aaron plays a good Californian, but really his heart is in New Jersey, and then a little bit of him also in upstate New York. So it's just a good place to be. But yeah, I think that's right? Appreciating kind of what we have, slowing down, recognizing what is around us, and not always thinking, oh, it has to be this really big thing out there, right? It has to be this huge thing. Same thing with publications. It's not about that. It's about the process. It's about the conversations that we can have around the table. Whether it's digital or not.
So beautiful. Like, I've been talking about this hyper local thing, like, up and down with everyone that I come across, Trent. That's so funny. Like, I don't think we've talked about it yet. So that's like, I've been saying that same, like, we in Troy, like, shout out to my new hometown of Troy, which I got to as soon as I could. But like, we've got enslaved people being de-arrested. Like, we've got the first women's labor union. Like, and our students often come to these towns and they don't think of themselves as residents, and that's not built into a higher education experience. That, like, the origins of the university system in Europe was a bunch of people coming to Bologna and being like, oh, well, we should get organized and like take control over what it means to be someone in Bologna wanting to learn things. So yeah, like, I think that's the exact kind of work that we should be thinking about, and thinking about games. Games to overthrow patriarchy and colonialism. That's a tall order, but there are problems in your town that, like, games can speak to, and help people come to imagine differently and to talk differently about together. And that's at arm's reach. That's something that you can do and build on and kind of experimental on. I think that we're at time here. Does anyone have any like links or like where people can find you online that we can toss out in 60 seconds?
Please, if you're interested in these conversations, follow us at Analog Game Studies. That's analoggamestudies.org. We try to publish stuff, but also follow Nick for more on the Bradley Tabletop Symposium, which I think happened at like a Metatopia last year, and the Generation Analog, which will probably happen again next year. So like I think there's lots of really exciting community things happening in the future. And Trent, if you have some plugs, please, I'll stop talking.
No, I was just going to invite people to jump in on the Discord, and there's the academic panelist track Discord. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where I would love to just kind of keep rolling conversations. I mean, this is one of the things that you don't get when you go all video, right? Is you don't get those clusters of people hanging around after a presentation. But maybe, hopefully we can use the Discord space to be able to have that, stimulate that a little bit.
Definitely, we want to hear like the designers that are listening to us right now saying like how we can interact. Like, tell us better. Tell us how to be better.
Yes, tell us how to be better.
Thank you guys. This was really, really fun. I'm good.
Yeah, well, it's great.